Hello, everybody, and welcome to this UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour, where we're going to discuss the area of potential UK-EU energy and climate cooperation. I'm Joël Rutter. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UK and a Changing Europe, and I'm delighted to be joined by the authors of a recent UKICE report on this subject. My colleague Joël Reland, a researcher at the Institute for Researcher at UK and Changing Europe, get my organisation right, and Camilla Born. Camilla worked in the Cabinet Office helping prepare COP26 and now is an independent climate and energy consultant. We're hoping to be joined as well by Heather Grabbe from the Breugel but we're just all back from the Conservative Party conference. And we're slightly worried that Heather may have actually forgotten this in all the excitement that's doing that, but no matter. So please post questions on Slido, and we will have a very good chat with Joel and Camilla, and hopefully with Heather if she appears. So do post questions away, and please, if you see a question that you like, please upvote it. And in the chat, we've already posted a link to the report that Joel and Camilla wrote. Joel, let's start off with you. What exactly is the current state of play? We didn't talk about energy much in the run-up to Brexit. We haven't really talked about energy very much after Brexit, but how did Brexit really affect the way in which the UK and the EU cooperated on energy issues?
Yeah, so as the report says, UK-EU cooperation on energy and climate is actually relatively constructive compared to lots of other areas. However, it's also constrained. There are significant limits on what they can do together. To give examples of what that means, in terms of energy cooperation, there are provisions in the TCA to make sure that the two sides continue to trade electricity, gas between one another after Brexit, the kind of efficient use of interconnectors which run under the channel. And broadly speaking, that has worked quite well. There hasn't been any major disruption. And actually, post Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the UK has played a really important role in replacing Russian fossil fuels, which are going into the EU grid, more coming instead from the UK. And so that element of work has been quite constructive. But at the same time, there are lots of things where the TCA says nothing about what they should do. So, for example, the war in Ukraine has also emphasized the growing importance and geopolitical importance of energy security. The idea that you don't want to be overly dependent on a country like Russia, for example, for your fossil fuel imports. And also in kind of wider geopolitical sort of developments, we've seen the risks of overdependence on a single country for other goods related to the green transition. So that might be semiconductors coming from Taiwan, or it might be solar panels coming from China. And so there's a recognition in both the UK and the EU that energy security needs to be bolstered. So that means diversifying your supply chains, finding critical raw materials, which are vital to many of the goods for the green transition. These things need to be worked on, and they could be worked on together. However, there's not really much in the TCA about that. So basically, it provides for a narrow, constructive, cooperative scope, but the bigger, more critical issues to do with energy aren't really dealt with. And perhaps on climate, I can leave it to Camilla.
Well, let's do that. Let's pass over to Camilla. Camilla, the UK and the EU used to be sort of big leaders on climate change, both with ambitious net zero targets. And I think that was an area where the UK actually had quite a big role in EU climate negotiations. But how do you see things since the UK left?
Yeah, so, as you say, absolutely, the UK and the EU have both led on climate, and the UK used to be a bit of a thorn in the EU member state side to really push the ambition as high as possible. And I think it continues to play that role. Obviously, it's different. You're not inside the tent, you're outside of the tent pushing. And there's some advantages of that. You can set precedent, you can speak on mic, and you can cajole things more in the public fora. But obviously, the UK isn't present in those preparatory meetings, helping to shape the EU's position. I'd say that COP26 became a really helpful moment that came at a really helpful moment as the UK was leaving the EU and leaving that negotiating group, which meant that the UK had a reason to keep engaging with the EU. And subsequently, there has been efforts for the EU and EU countries to work with other OECD countries who are in favour of ambition, and they have new spaces for coordination. So it's different, absolutely, but certainly there's a lot of alignment and seen lots of benefits of continuing to work together on those international climate components.
And Heather, welcome. It's lovely to have you here. It's won't say it's a relief to have you, but it is lovely to be able to see you here. From the EU point of view, are they happy with the way in which energy and climate cooperation is now working as contained in the TCA and other sort of, outside the TSA fora? Or do they actually think that this is an area where there is scope for looking at deepening the relationship?
Well, one thing is how things are seen in the EU institutions and the kind of EU overall consensus. And then you've got some specific member states with specific interests, i.e. those around the North Sea. And so overall, the EU is pretty happy. The EU side in general is pretty happy with the TCA. They got most of what they wanted. It's a fairly steady state, and they're super grateful for the mood music having changed. Keir Starmer's here in Brussels today, meeting Ursula von der Leyen and various other people. All of that has meant that there's scope for a good reception for new initiatives. But the expectation over here is that those initiatives will come from the UK side. They're not going to come from the EU side. And the big looming issue is how far the UK is going to align with the EU on its emissions trading system and on CBAM. So at the moment, the UK, of course, is now in the business of developing its own CBAM, but the UK's carbon price is much lower than the EU carbon price, and the scope of the ETS is less, and of course is not as wide as in the EU. And of course, the European Union is about to introduce ETS2, which will cover buildings and transport. So the question is, will the UK maintain, the forbidden words now of dynamic alignment and actually make its ETS and its CBAM very compatible with those of the EU? I think there are actually very good reasons to do so, because essentially lots of countries are now moving towards carbon pricing. It would make sense if carbon pricing happened more uniformly and on a similar basis, at least in terms of how to measure emission, roughly similar carbon prices. That's what would incentivize decarbonisation in many markets. So for the UK and the EU to have this alignment would already help. So that's the kind of issue that's coming up. And then I think there's very particular interests of some of the EU member states that are around the North Sea who would very much like to see stronger cooperation. It's very much welcoming the UK going back into North Sea energy cooperation. And I think the building of infrastructure is the key thing there, especially interconnectors, because it would make so much sense if you've got particularly the wind power, but also solar and other sources of renewable energy, tradable and directly dispatchable across the North Sea. That would just make sense for everybody. And also, in addition to the interconnectors, doing, of course, the vexed question of grid upgrade, so that the grids can actually take the energy that's being generated and dispatch it immediately. And then there's all the questions about how to store it and so on. But I think, so you've got I think on the whole, TCA sets the basis, and the EU is fairly happy with that, which means the UK side will have to be making the initiative, and they're waiting for that. And I think ETS CBAM will be a very important short-term thing that the UK really needs to show its intentions on. But then I think the longer term North Sea investments offer a lot of opportunities.
Okay, let's take those two issues that Heather's raised in turn. Joel, what do you think the prospects are for the UK, if you like, sort of, I assume the EU would expect it to ditch the proposals that the Conservatives were floating for its own CBAM and align with the EU CBAM, and as Heather was saying, also align the UK ETS with the EU ETS. Do you think that that is now back in prospect? And what would that mean for British industry and for other aspects of the way in which the post-Brexit trading regime are working?
So it's hard to say whether it's in prospect because the Labour Party has been so ambiguous on its EU policy since it came to power. There was a briefing in the FT just before the general election where it was mentioned that the Labour Party would potentially be interested in this. So you suspect it's something that somewhere in some organ within Whitehall they are looking at, but whether it's actually, is it going to be on the table in the conversation today between Keir Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen? I don't know. The two barriers to it, one is technical and one is political. The technical barrier is that it's quite difficult to link emissions trading schemes. Famously, it took 9 or 10, well, I say famously, within this world, famously, it took 9 or 10 years for Switzerland and the EU to link their schemes. Potentially, it would be easier for the UK because it is virtually the same in design as the EU's, but there are still technical things that you have to overcome about how they are linked, about how you align carbon prices and so forth. And then there's the political aspect, which is giving up a degree of sovereignty. The UK would have to say that it was willing to adhere to EU stability mechanisms and probably would have to give an element of its ETS revenues to Brussels as well. So you're sending money back to Brussels. And those are the kinds of Brexit red lines which were sort of unbreakable for the previous government. Whether this government is willing to go there is an open question. The economic incentives for doing so are quite strong. I mean, potentially hundreds of millions of pounds a year in export tariffs on UK goods under the EU CBAM if they don't link their emissions trading schemes. And for electricity, it could be particularly damaging because of the way that EU ETS or CBAM tariffs on electricity are calculated. UK electricity will be overcharged, and that will not only increase the cost of exports, but it will increase the cost of electricity probably for EU consumers as well, because they import a fair amount from the UK. It could also have quite difficult questions around whether it applies in Northern Ireland. So there are some really, really strong incentives for the two sides to find a solution, but they're not easy to do. I guess my one just concluding point would be that nothing the UK is asking for is particularly easy. An SPS deal is also very technical. It also involves a trade-off over sovereignty. And I would wager that linking your ETS schemes actually would have a bigger and more immediate economic benefit. So I would say there is a potentially an incentive there, but will Labour go for it? I still don't know.
So Joel, just to come on to that, why does it imply, I'm very interested in Heather's view of this as well, why does it imply some degree of revenue sharing? And surely it's a bit of a self-inflicted wound by the EU to put up electricity prices to EU consumers by applying the CBAM to electricity exports. We saw, I think, when there was water shortages in France, that there was a lot of energy exports from the UK into France when their power plants couldn't operate. So why on earth is the EU, going to do something which seems to exact quite a high price from EU energy consumers? I'm not sure I quite get the rationale for that. And I'm bringing Heather on those.
Do you want me to go or do you want Heather to go?
You go first, and then then get Heather to mark your answers, Joel.
Okay. I mean, on the EU side, perhaps it's a little bit of an unforeseen consequence. And it does feel to me like this electricity trading question is a particularly poor piece of design within the wider kind of design of the EU CBAM. And so maybe there's a way you can carve something out around electricity in particular. Also, because I think it's quite unrealistic that any ETS linkage will be done before 2026 when the EU CBAM starts to take effect. So it could be that we have a slightly compromised fudged deal where to begin with, the UK is exempted from certain parts. So maybe you say, we are going to achieve linkage by X date in the future. And in the meantime, because we know the questions of electricity and Northern Ireland, for example, are particularly vexed, we're going to have little carve-outs there, because otherwise the risk is if the UK is given exemptions, the rest of the world is going to cry foul and say, why aren't we being given these same exemptions if the UK hasn't formally linked its emissions trading scheme? So it's a really tough and complex question. But I do agree with you, Joel, that given the potential cost of the EU and the immediacy of the UK to the EU's energy grid and the kind of high degree of interconnection, I think exemptions probably need to be found that wouldn't necessarily be afforded other countries.
Heather, what do you think? And then Camilla.
I think it's highly unlikely that there would be exemptions specifically for the UK. That's exactly what the EU wants to avoid. I mean, the US is asking for exemptions too from CBAM. So is India, so is China. Everybody wants exemptions from CBAM. No, but I think, I mean, the key thing that you need for CBAM is what is recognized as an equivalent scheme, equivalent carbon pricing. And that's what, for example, the EU is now working with India on. You know, what could count as India? So there are Indian ministers who are arguing what India will do is simply apply a carbon tax at the border, which it will itself collect and will go into Indian budget, state revenues. But that will be carbon pricing, and therefore it's an equivalent scheme. So that's the kind of thing that other countries are trying to negotiate with the EU at the moment. Now, with the UK, if the UK has a CBAM which is taxing carbon at the border, both for imports, but also has domestic carbon pricing, which of course is the key thing that the US lacks. The US is talking about putting in place a CBAM without domestic pricing. That's highly problematic to have that US formulation because it's not seen as an equivalent system by the EU. But so you need an equivalent system, which is essentially putting a tax on carbon in order to change the price incentives. But I don't see why the revenues of either the UK CBAM would have to go to the EU or the UK ETS would have to go to the EU. I mean, even within the EU, there's been quite a lot of debate about using the EU's own revenues from CBAM. There was talk about, for example, redistributing those to developing countries to help them to decarbonize faster. There's been all kinds of talk about different ways of using those revenues. There's nothing hard and fast, I think, about that. And the ETS revenues at the moment, those go into the EU budget. They will go up. That's seen as an important source of revenue within the EU. But I don't think it would necessarily. I don't see why the UK would be expected to transfer revenues. But with CBAM, the idea is it's supposed to be revenue neutral, right? That ultimately carbon pricing within an economy like the ETS, you want that carbon price to generate revenue in order to finance decarbonization. But the CBAM is supposed to incentivize exactly that kind of carbon pricing. It's not meant to be generating money. I've even heard, senior commission officials working on CBAM saying the ideal CBAM is one that never generates any revenue because all of our trading partners implement their own carbon pricing schemes, which will be much more effective at home. They keep those revenues in order to do decarbonization. They don't come to the EU. So I think I would detach this revenue question from you're absolutely right about the technical questions about electricity market design, which, by the way, of course, the EU is also working on because it's well recognized that in the EU, electricity markets do not work optimally to encourage the renewable system.
Camilla, what do you think? I mean, and just in terms of British, I mean, what is the sort of gap currently between UK and EU carbon prices? I think it did get quite big, didn't it, at one point? But
yeah, so currently the UK is lower, reasonably significantly, but not in amount of that. And
Camilla, you're breaking up. Do you think you could possibly turn your camera off?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Better. Yeah.
Okay, fingers crossed. Okay. The case for ETS leakage isn't the cliff edge of the CBAM. It is the fact that you are expanding the market opportunities for industry. And I think it's important to hold on to that. Yes, the cliff edge is helpful in some ways because it forces a very technical, difficult process, as Joel described, to come to a head and for some choices to be made about how that's going to be managed. But there is a huge opportunity for the UK and the EU to come together on this. CBAM and the EU comes into force from 2026, which is both an admin and a financial cost. And that's something that can be avoided. I don't think it requires any transfer of revenues. It is an opportunity to expand the market and work together to achieve that. And the appetite for doing so is really growing across industry. What will be really critical in the next few months is an understanding of the intention of doing that or not, and a sense of a timeline for addressing that, because January 2026 is going to come around very quickly. And how do we avoid that admin and finance burden of the CBAM when we don't need to, and when we can get so many opportunities from linking the two ETSs?
Heather, just on a quick question, are we convinced the EU will go ahead in 2026? Does that look absolutely set, or is there a possibility of just timing delay?
So that question gets asked in the Commission press room about once a week, and the line so far is not, no. Now things can change, but I don't think it will happen, and the reason why is because the whole CBAM is essential to the EU's whole carbon pricing strategy. So you can't phase out the free allowances for EU businesses, especially for heavy industry in the EU, without bringing in CBAM, because the carbon leakage will be very, and even just to signal that there might be a delay at this point could cause carbon leakage. Basically companies moving dirty production abroad to sell into the EU from other countries, and undermining European firms that are decarbonizing. So I think there's every kind of market and commercial incentive not to delay. But the other thing is, it's written in legislation. It's really hard to change this. CBAM was agreed between all of the member states and the European Parliament and the Council and the Commission long ago. It's been it's been very well signaled. They've now done the initial reporting phase. Everything's actually rolled out fairly smoothly. So there's no reason to delay, and to suggest to delay, it's a bit like the ban on internal combustion engines. If you start moving the goalposts, that's very confusing for investors. And it penalizes the businesses that have made the investments, businesses not only in the EU but outside the EU, that have made the investments in decarbonisation. So there's a moral hazard involved also in delaying it. And so far things are going according to plan. What's happening is some countries, like the UK, for political reasons, are going to have to catch up fast. But I don't think the EU delaying it, again, that would penalise countries that have already done the homework on carbon pricing. So I don't see that. There may be delays on other things that have been less well planned and less well signaled. That can happen, but I doubt it on CBAM.
Now, I've got a question here from Matt Hind in Brussels. Hi, I'm Matt. Who said the EU institutions may be happy with the trade and cooperation agreement, but EU industry, especially around the North Sea, isn't. How important is the voice of EU industry in improving the situation? So Heather mentioned this other area about cooperation in the North Sea. Before I bring Heather in, Joel or Camilla, I mean, what's the issue in the North Sea? What's at stake there? Is this actually about building kit, getting the stuff on shore? I've just been at two-party conferences where chairing net zero events, everything has been talking about grid connections all the time and the difficulties of getting things onshore. So what are the big issues, and what would better cooperation in the North Sea look like?
So perhaps I'll jump in and say that the number one thing to address is electricity trading. So under the TCA, there are accommodations for addressing electricity trading, because obviously the UK left the single market, but left EU.
Camilla, you're going to have to turn your camera off again because your line's breaking up again, I'm afraid.
That it also, Norway is inside the energy market as well, even though they aren't an EU member, but we are currently not. And so the number one thing to do is to address this electricity trading arrangement so that we are able to have a much clearer landscape for investors. This is particularly important for the next generation of interconnectors, the hybrid assets that we need, so that you can have interconnections to multiple places. And that will be really important for the scale of offshore wind we want to achieve. So first past the post, there are many other reasons why we need to do this to ensure the best kind of cooperation we can demonstrate is to sort out these electricity trading arrangements. It's accommodated for under the TCA, but we've completely lost sense of where our roadmap for actually addressing it is. And that's something that needs to be resolved yesterday.
Joel, is there a prospect of addressing it? Maybe not yesterday, but maybe tomorrow? Maybe
potentially. I think this is something where the change of government in the UK, I think, could make a difference, because by all accounts, the big problem is a lack of political will so far. So the issue is being discussed. There are discussions under the TCA's committee structures, but the problem is they tend to be rooms full of officials, and what happens is it's a very technically difficult thing to work through. You're basically having to come up with a new trading model which doesn't really exist at the moment. So that's quite difficult and easily runs into technical barriers. And quite naturally for officials, it's hard to break through those. So you kind of need a degree of political intervention, as Camilla's saying, around a roadmap to say this is the point we need to get to, and that's often what it takes to slightly fudge the more difficult questions and find a sort of mutually agreeable outcome based on the kind of political priorities of both sides. And maybe with Labour, that's something which is more likely to happen. Up to now, I think the political incentive has been relatively low because the current costs of the inefficiencies of energy trading are not enormous. I mean, it's maybe 0.5%, maybe a little bit more on the overall kind of wholesale cost. So, it's significant, but it's not something which is deeply in the pockets of consumers. But over time, those costs are likely to extrapolate. And again, Labour has emphasised wanting to be a clean energy superpower, which means decarbonising the electricity grid by 2030. That really is going to rely on improved cooperation in the North Seas in terms of interconnectors, grids, and so forth. And so resolving this question would be quite an important step in terms of addressing the blockers, as Ed Miliband called it, to that 2030 target.
I mean, it also means building lots more kit in the North Sea. I mean, is there a big benefit there to proper cooperation with other members, other coastal states? And does that have to go through the EU, or does that go through a separate institutional forum?
So we have the North Seas Energy Cooperation Group, which I think is 8 EU member states plus Norway, where they talk about a lot of this stuff which can go on in the North Sea. And this was actually provided for in the TCA, that the UK would have some level of cooperation engagement with that group. It used to be a full member, but left as a result of Brexit. However, there is still, and the UK has now reassociated to the NSEC, as it's called, but there are still limitations on the conversations in which it can partake. And so that's another area to potentially look at, is the depth of the UK's integration into the NSEC group, which might open up some of that stuff which you're alluding to, Joel. And I think possibly Camilla might have some stuff to say on that as well.
Camilla, do you want to come in on that?
I'm going to turn my camera off and then I will. So certainly on the NSEC, the North Seas Energy Cooperation Group, there's appetite growing from all countries for greater participation of the UK to be able to better understand how you can look at joint economic planning and joint infrastructure planning across these pieces. I think it's also important to say that there's a really good opportunity to set precedent here in the North Seas as well, because in most cases, you will be in a situation where you want to build interconnectors between different countries who have wildly different jurisdictions and are not part of necessarily the same economic club. So I think getting this right is a really good offer for the UK, the EU to do together, to then also think about, what does that model mean for the Mediterranean? What does that model mean for the Baltics? What's the equivalent in Asia? And so there's huge opportunity here to, one, prove concept, and two, think about then how that could be applied elsewhere.
So Heather, could I throw in a question here that's come in from John Springford? John tweeted this morning. I don't know whether he knew our event was happening or not, but John Springford, who used to be at the Centre for European Reform, was saying that he thought an early area for better cooperation could be the UK and the EU to build what he called an electricity union, if we're allowing people to intervene. I'll get him to explain quite what he meant. But he's now posted a question. I'm going to put this first to you, Heather. Whether you'd like to comment on how much electricity trade across Europe could reduce the need for national generation on storage, especially as electricity demand rises. And obviously, the move towards net zero necessitates a move to mass electrification to wean us off fossil fuels so we can benefit from clean power. Do you see prospects here? Is there, and are people in the EU really keen to include the UK in, if you like, some sort of future thinking about cross-continental energy?
This is the future. This is long term. This is what makes total sense. If you've got what we all need to aim for, which is 100% renewables-based system, you've got to have lots of different ways of balancing the grid. You've got to have lots of ways of using to the maximum the energy that's available in the moment, as well as having storage for, for when there are what the Germans call the Dunkelflaute, where you have neither solar nor wind. And the cheapest and easiest way to do that is by having a larger grid with multiple sources of energy available at any one time. That's much better than what we have currently available in terms of battery storage and other methods of storage, be that storing it in hydro and or indeed hydrogen. So this is clearly going to work. The UK is not the principal problem here. This is a much wider issue. As Camilla was saying, this is really across continents. And I really liked her point about if there can be a really good model built for UK-EU cooperation on this, how helpful that could be in setting precedents for where it could happen elsewhere. In addition to the Mediterranean and the Baltic, which she mentioned, there's also the Black Sea, where it would be hugely advantageous for example, Bulgaria, Romania, to have an integrated grid with Moldova and Ukraine, both of which have actually already done synchronization with the European grid. Even in the initial weeks of the invasion, they managed this feat. They're already synchronized with the European grid, and that's helped them enormously when Russia has targeted their energy infrastructure and taken out their fossil fuel capabilities. As they build renewables, which they're doing, it helps enormously if they can do that in the Black Sea, and also, of course, with Turkey, so with which is outside the EU. So that point about this is a common challenge for everybody in building renewables, is to have an electricity system where the market works well to reduce prices for consumers. So key point that Joel made, also key point that Mario Draghi has made about competitiveness. We all need lower energy prices because the European continent as a whole is very energy poor. We don't have sources of renewable fossil fuel sources, but we also don't, apart from North Sea gas, which is running out and so on, but also in terms of renewables, we're building them quickly, but we're resource poor. And so we need to be able to think long term and have transcontinental solutions. Okay, so having said that, John is right that to decrease the need for storage as electricity demand increases, yes, it makes sense to have a much more integrated grid, and one where you can balance between different sources, and you can use the comparative advantages of different countries having, some have more onshore wind, some more offshore, some have more solar, and so on. Some of the key interconnectors that are missing are between countries which have these different sources. For example, between France and Spain, because France didn't want, Spanish solar generated electricity to compete with their nuclear and hydro, for example, just putting it crudely. So this is not a problem that's unique to UK-EU. This is something that's also inside the EU. And I think the key thing really is now to think about how to get a properly integrated grid. And as Camilla said, this is an economic question and it's an infrastructure question. So there's building the kit, actually building the grids, especially for the uptake. It's not so much the dispatching, it's the uptake from multiple sources, where the grid was not designed for that. The grid was designed for just a few power stations to be feeding in, whereas now you've got feeding into the grid from a huge number of sources, including rooftop solar, including individual households, individual companies, as it should be. So everybody needs to be making those investments. But then you've also got the whole economic side, which is how do you pay for those investments? How do you give investors the confidence to invest for the longer term? Now, at Breugel, we've done quite a lot of work on this. I have colleagues who published a number of different papers on how to get the grid investments and also how to organize it, because at the moment, the markets are not well designed for this. But there's also a fundamental basic economic problem that this requires a huge amount of upfront investment, and then longer term, prices will fall dramatically. Electricity will become much cheaper. It needs to, for competitiveness, to ease the burden on European consumers, and also to electrify the economy for decarbonisation. It needs to do that. But that's not a fantastic proposition to take to investors, saying, please come up with all the trillions, invest them in the grid now, and then later the revenues will be much smaller than they are now. So that's an economic conundrum where the state has to have a role, and where I think interstate deals, shall we say, which would include UK-EU political agreements, are absolutely necessary, because the private sector will not be incentivized to do this on its own.
So, Heather, to what extent do you think that the UK and the EU are in competition for sort of scarce private capital? A lot of talk about, supply chains, things like cables, where people say actually everybody is trying to make this move at the same time. Is there, are they primarily competitors or are they collaborators on this? And how do you actually move it into a position where it might be competition into actually more productive collaboration?
Yeah, collaboration is essential because we're all in the same boat. We're all resource poor, we're all energy poor countries. And we also have very different strengths. All these different countries have different strengths in terms of what they can offer as energy sources, right? They've got a different amount of their energy mixes are all very different. And those should be sources of synergy, really. But the danger is you get beggar thy neighbor policies of, I'm going to do my critical raw materials deal with X country instead of you, so I'll get the copper for my cables. I'll do my deal with China rather than you because so to get my my clean tech. That's not going to work very well. Because ultimately we all benefit from the shift to renewables. So collaboration is clearly very much needed. And I think the big issue is going to be how to ensure that the new push towards industrial policy, which we're seeing on the EU side, clean industrial deal coming quite soon, is something that doesn't cause that within the European Union. The whole point of having a clean industrial deal at EU level is to prevent member states from competing with one another for example, for raw materials from outside Europe, and to ensure that the industrial policy doesn't lead to a distortion of competition, of healthy competition. So this is a very live issue inside the EU, and it's a fast-moving debate. So it's going to be quite a challenge, I think, for UK ministers to keep up with that in determining what they would like the UK's priorities to be.
And if I may, just to add briefly to that, I very much agree with that. And it's even harder to keep up when there is no fora currently for having an ongoing conversation about this. So the US has a trade and technology council, which it shares with the EU. And I think there's an interesting opportunity to explore, could you have a transition trade and technology council, perhaps between the EU and the UK? Because we need to be having these conversations, what tariffs are being put on Chinese goods, or are we not putting those tariffs and therefore we're maybe become a dumping route for lots of different technologies? Or how do we want to collaborate to establish different hubs of green manufacturing? And how do we do that together? And how do we build the skills needs up across? And we've got strong universities, we've got a strong background in that kind of training in the UK. How do we bring that together with the EU? And these kind of propositions and prospects just haven't been considered yet. And yes, I completely agree that the EU has its 27 member states, that it's rapidly trying to work out how it's going to do that themselves and what that means for one another. But the UK also needs to get ahead of the curve and think about how it plays its role and how it's helpful rather than obstructive, which is ultimately helpful to the UK supply chain as well.
So Camilla, Mark English has posted a question which you've now opened the way for me to put for you by your mentioning tariffs. He said the EU is about to slap big tariffs on Chinese electric cars, but the UK isn't, as far as we know at the moment. Is there a tension between strategic autonomy and the 2035 target to end the sale of new petrol cars? But is there also scope there for tension between the EU and UK over the attitude to China? We've got other questions about, where Labour might go on China, and some of these really interesting questions about dependence on China, I think, for some of the energy transition. Camilla, do you want to have first go at that?
This is really tough. And yes, there is absolutely scope for tension, which is why there needs to be dialogue and cooperation. That does not mean the UK has to do the same as the EU or the EU has to do the same as the UK. It just means that there needs to be a discussion so that the full implications are actually understood and that they are benefiting European citizens and consumers as best as possible. There is a tension because, yes, you may want to onshore or friendshore as much as you can of EVs, for example, but they're going to be more expensive if you're getting them from Europe, and they will be cheaper from China. And so there are a whole range of different choices. It's also not totally straightforward. It's not like, oh, you can only take this very sophisticated EV from China, and that's the thing you have to buy in Europe. You can take components, elements, parts that actually help EU then or the UK build local value out of that EV. And we need to think about the multiple parts of a supply chain. I don't see the UK or the EU, for that matter, stepping away from engagement with China in this space. They have invested. It is so impressive. They have bet their economic and political futures on this transition. We need to be also doing the same. It's the direction of travel we have in some ways, but we've got a long way to go in others. So the thing that I would really call for is creating a space for that kind of coordination, working through those risks and opportunities, and having space and opportunity to manage the tensions, because absolutely they're going to be there. This is mainstream macroeconomics, this is economic policy, this is industrial strategy, and this is normal. This would be the same if we were talking about another major sector, which was the huge area of infrastructure investment. It's the same kind of process we expect. So we should be real about that and take that on. Climate isn't a nice moral thing to work on. It is something which is at the heart of the way you plan your economy, and we need to be grown up about that and think about how we better coordinate with our partners.
Joel, any views on that? And then I'll come to Heather. Joel, you're inaudible. Joel, you're completely inaudible. Heather, do you want to come in on that while Joel fixes his inaudibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think Camilla's put her finger on it, that I would just add 2 points really to the excellent analysis you just gave. One is that when it comes to trade policy, these are very complex international supply chains where actually it's very hard for one government on its own to act and not get a massive reaction, which may negate the what it was trying to do. So if you take the example of EVs, okay, so there's the problem that, China has subsidized the development of EVs, and now they're very cheap, right? That's a problem for European car makers. It's not actually a problem for European consumers or for the climate transition. It's a public good that there are lots of, going to be shortly, very competitively priced Chinese electric vehicles on the market. The reason why the EU is looking at the tariffs is because of the subsidies that were available to these Chinese cars. So it's the unfair competition element. But I note that, I mean, I think the question was asked in terms of, it's about to slap enormous tariffs on Chinese cars. These are not enormous tariffs. The US has put in 100% tariffs. The EU is looking, in the 20s, maybe in the 30s. Percent tariffs, which are not going to increase the price dramatically of these cars. Plus, what exactly is a Chinese car? Most of the many European car makers have been bought by Chinese companies. Volvo, for example, is owned by, and the Volvo electric vehicles are made in China, at least one of the models that I looked at. But if you take the Mini is a good example of this. So Mini, iconic British brand, owned by a German company, BMW. The electric Mini is manufactured in China. Now, as a result of all of the kind of tariff talk, as I understand it, BMW is thinking about taking the electric Mini production out of China and moving it back to Oxford, which is where the Mini was first made. Is that a triumph of British industrial policy? No, that's because of global forces and a rather complex set of political economy constraints around car makers. So I think the moral of this whole story about the electric vehicles is you've got to think long term about really what a kind of economy you're going to have, and it's going to benefit the whole economy if vehicles are electric, because then you don't have so many of the climate impacts that have enormous economic impact. I mean, look at the cost of climate change already in Europe in terms of floods and fires and extreme temperatures and extreme weather and so on. It's very difficult for all of us in Europe, whether that's EU members or those outside the EU, like the UK or Norway, dealing with the US-China trade tensions and trade wars. That means that decisions about how to react to the US putting tariffs on things like electric vehicles become really, really difficult, especially given that European countries are so much more dependent on trade with China and so much more open to trade as a whole. The US economy is only what, 27% dependent on foreign trade, whereas with the EU it's more than half. I think the UK is even more than that. So this is a really tricky area where it's not as if there's just a policy that could solve the problems. And I think especially this point that about the US pressure is going to be really difficult, because imagine Trump comes into office after the election on the 5th of November, and he makes an impossible deal available to the UK and indeed any other country that's willing to take it, where he says, right, we're going to withdraw from NATO, but I'll extend the US security umbrella to your country if you join my trade war with China, right? What kind of a conundrum is that going to provide to the UK government? It's going to be a huge conundrum also to plenty of other governments. But even if it's a Harris administration, the US attitudes towards China are not going to change rapidly. And the US can afford to have a trade war with China that no European country can really afford to have. We're going to have to navigate this with great difficulty while continuing to depend on Chinese clean tech for our decarbonization, because there really is no alternative when it comes to solar and soon to EVs. This is a really complex area, and I think that's where there are no simple answers, but basically the UK is in the same position as European countries, not the same position as the US.
Joel, do you want to come in on that if you're now audible again?
Yeah, I think my computer's revived itself. Yeah, I wanted to build, I think, on a couple of points Camilla was making. So the first about kind of the need to have those conversations. I think she's absolutely right that they might not always agree on everything, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about them. And I think this is kind of probably a new level of maturity, which the UK-EU relationship has now reached, which wasn't there even a year or two ago, where everything was kind of framed through the prism of tension and, zero-sum politics, effectively, the one side wins or the other. Whereas I think when you have a slightly more stable settlement, you can accept that you can have differences of opinion on something, but you still try and work through for common good. The problem is those spaces for conversation don't really exist. There's really not much structure for political dialogue at the moment in the relationship. We've got quite a rare, I think I read it's the first time since 2019 we've had a sort of formal visit of a UK Prime Minister to Brussels today. And there's no regular UK-EU summit or political dialogue where they can talk about these things. So I also think it's maybe interesting to see whether this, putative UK-EU security pact that we've heard quite a lot about in quite a sort of wide-ranging definition where it could cover everything from energy and migration to health and cyber, is that going to take off? And is that going to be an area where you can discuss things like energy, industrial strategy, tariffs, and so forth? That's, I think, one question. And then another much more kind of micro question, which is in terms of the management of the TCA, is what happens to rules of origin for electric vehicles in 2027, when effectively what it means is the proportion of an electric vehicle which has to be manufactured in the UK or the EU, and also the battery specifically, I think has to hit 55% for both. That's quite a big uptick on what we have now. And what we saw in 2024, the start of this year, when they previously tried to increase it by a less significant amount, is that car makers said, we can't do this. And so if you change these rules, we're going to be hit with tariffs on the export of our vehicles between the UK and the EU. The reason it took so long to decide is that the Commission and France weren't particularly keen on doing this. There is that kind of desire to have greater strategic autonomy. These rules are designed to increase EU-based manufacturing. And so in 2027, again, we might see that same resistance to tampering with the deadline, because we want to kind of push forward with this onshoring of manufacturing capacity. But I can very much see on the other side, the UK saying, hang on, we need to be able to, we're very export reliant electric vehicle industry. We don't want to impose these tariffs on our industry, and having a tension between the UK and EU positions on that. So I think that's a challenge to look at going forwards, which they're going to have to get their heads around, and really industry would benefit from getting their heads around it early, because the fact it took so long last time to come to a decision meant that car makers had sunk costs into sort of mitigating for what was going to change in the rules, and they'd rather not have to do that again with quite good reason.
No, that's a good warning. Going to have a couple more questions, but I just wanted to ask Heather, what's going to be different about this commission? We haven't actually got a confirmed commission yet, but what do you think is going to be different on climate and energy policy in the new commission from the last von der Leyen commission? We saw in the European Parliament elections, rise of some of the more right-wing parties, the centre holding, but quite a reversal for some of the Greens in the European elections. We're seeing in the Conservative leadership election here much more scepticism about net zero, the wisdom of doing that, the way we're doing it, than we've heard from the Conservative Party here before. And I just wondered whether we might see a bit of a change of direction in the new commission.
Well, we've certainly seen changes in the language that's been used. You don't hear green very much, but you hear clean all the time. Clean industrial deal, clean energy. But definitely, as you say, there are a number of parties, particularly the way that the radical right, particularly radical right populist parties, doing well in some of the countries in the European Parliament elections and also in national elections, most notably Austria last Sunday, obviously Italy and others, and coming into coalitions in the Netherlands and in Sweden. This makes a difference because they are much more ideologically flexible parties, which tend to seize on one issue or another. They've now turned quite anti-green. 10 years ago, they didn't really have a view on green issues, but now they've turned anti-green. But having said that, mainstream parties, and I think crucially the private sector, have really got it that climate change is real and it's happening now. The floods, the wildfires, the extreme weather, they're happening right now, and they're having economic costs right now. They're damaging infrastructure. Slovenia lost 16% of its GDP last year because of 48 hours of extraordinary rainfall. I would imagine the economic costs of the floods that are currently right there in Central Europe will be much higher than that. So these adaptation costs, and Camilla mentioned this earlier, these are core to economic policy. These aren't a nice to have. They aren't something you can do with action and then just abandon in the next government, because they're having real costs in the economy. The impact of climate change is already doing that. So I think adaptation is going to become much more important at EU level. It will also be more important in the UK, and we can expect to see larger amounts of national budgets devoted to that. And if you look at the way that insurers see the world, they're expecting huge amounts of money to be required because they're not going to be able to insure, parts of the country in many EU member states, also in the UK. Because if climate change continues with, the Copernicus meteorological outlook is that the EU, the European continent as a whole, is warming at twice the global average, which doesn't necessarily mean it will just be warmer. It will also be a lot wetter. So much for making wine in Scotland and so on. We could just simply find ourselves a great deal wetter as well as warmer. So because of all of this is now part of every economic portfolio. And I think for that reason, it's there in the Treasury. It's the central banks are worried about it. They're starting to take climate risk and also biodiversity loss, ecosystem services loss, much more seriously as a risk to financial stability. You see that in the European Central Bank as well. So I think these are areas in which there may be pushback on aspects of the energy transition now, but there's no hiding from climate change. And I think the question is whether politicians start to make a trade-off between adaptation and mitigation. If they start to say, well, we in Europe, we've reduced our emissions down to well under 10%. Of the global average. If the EU achieves Fit for 55, it'll be less than 5% of global emissions will come from the EU. Therefore, we've done our bit, and therefore we should just spend all our money on adaptation here in Europe, rather than trying to ensure mitigation both here and in other parts of the world, and especially the key thing of helping other countries which are much more vulnerable and much more resource poor in terms of public money that's available to do adaptation too. Because historically, we're responsible for most of the emissions that are up there, the stock of emissions, even if our contribution to the flow is much smaller. So all of these issues are harsh realities that remain there. And I think that's why policies are not going to shift enormously. We may see pushing out of some deadlines, but ultimately we're going to have to stay the course. And I think it's very important that politicians make that clear in order to bring in the private sector investment that will be needed. Otherwise, we'll simply have a really radical transition in 10 years' time, which will be much more expensive, much more disruptive than trying to do it in a smooth path now.
Camilla, building on a bit of that, how do you see the UK and the EU coordinating the future in the international fora around climate change? What scope is there for more shared climate diplomacy?
So I think the number one thing that the UK and the EU need to do is deliver at home. And that is the best tool for international diplomacy, is being able to show that you've delivered. And not just showing you've delivered by, I've picked a high percentage target, look how good we are, we're following science, which you should do, and I completely commend, but a look at this financial instrument that we're using, which is really effective for having stability and crowding in private sector investment. This is applicable in country X, Y, and Z. Or look at this opportunity that we've invested in to build out skills within this kind of population, and that has afforded us to build out all this economic opportunity. And I think it's absolutely right what Heather says about the climate impacts locking in the inevitability of the transition. But the other thing that's locking in the inevitability of the transition is the opportunities that are coming with it. And as I was traveling around the world with Alok Sharma ahead of COP26, you know, every government we went to saw the future, the modern future, as clean. And that was the direction of travel. So it's also about our competitiveness and how we want to position ourselves to be able to have that kind of impact. Looking at what models that with other countries as partners, I think is really, really critical. Looking at the economic opportunities there, frankly, I think I would much rather my pension was going into middle income country investments, because the opportunities are so much bigger than it was going into advanced economies. And we're not necessarily doing that. We have these perceived ideas about what cost of capital is in other parts of the world. And these are the kind of structural issues that we need to think about how together we can address that. Part of that means, how does the UK and the EU international institutions? Yes, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change through the COPs, but also the multilateral development banks, the regional development banks. We are members in those places, and how can we innovate together and work out how we can move those agendas forward so that we can be more impactful as multiple partners in those spaces. It is happening, but it's not happening enough. And we are so aligned in many cases, and we can use that kind of coordination and cooperation together much more effectively.
That's really interesting. Joel, I want to come back to a more prosaic question for you, I'm afraid. Question from Anonymous. 2026, the energy chapter expires, but so does the fisheries chapter. What are we to read into that linkage, and what are the risks and possibilities around that? Is it really fish power?
I think, yeah, it shows you how politics has moved on in the last few years, because back in 2020, that was a very deliberate decision by the EU to stop the UK playing hardball over the renegotiation of fisheries in 2026. The not so subtle subtext is, if you try and mess around with the fish, you know, we have the power to end energy cooperation. You don't want to do that. And we saw kind of a sort of a trailer of that, I guess, maybe in 2021, it probably was, when France threatened to curtail energy supplies to Jersey over access of fishers to British waters. I think in a post-Ukraine world, it seems like an absolute folly to try and trade energy off against fish in that way. And so the incentives to maintain the energy chapter are very, very strong. But at the same time, it's not going to be easy, because fish remains still a very politically sensitive topic in the EU, especially member states like France and the Netherlands. And France has a presidential election in 2027, which is a year after the negotiations happen. You can be sure that Macron will want to make sure that he's not being seen to relent to the British on the fisheries question. So there could be quite strong member state pressure to push quite hard there. I say the more sort of glass half full perspective on the issue is maybe a Labour government which isn't quite so wedded to fisheries as a political issue in the first place might be willing to trade something off over fish and say, okay, we'll give you a little bit more access. We're not going to make this the kind of political totem issue that Boris Johnson and David Frost did, and in return, what can we do on energy, or what can we do on other issues actually in the relationship where they want to go a little bit deeper. So it could be a friction, but it could actually be an opportunity if the government plays its cards right.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left, so one word answers from all of you. Quick wins. Where's the best place to look for a quick win, Joel?
How quick is it? I don't know. ETS linkage.
ETS linkage. Camilla.
The TCA, so ETS linkage and electricity trading, because it's already in there. Just get on with it. And any wins include the North Seas.
And Heather, where would you look for a quick win?
Ukraine. Strategic alignment, because ultimately we're all in the same boat. I mean, Mario Draghi had a really great quote this week. He said, you know, national sovereignty, you know, it's not all cracked up to be. It's not quite how he said it, but he said, you know, it's something countries can't afford anymore because we are all so exposed to the global economy and to global geopolitics.
Okay, that's a great place to end. I'm going to thank my panelists. Do watch out for more UK and a Changing Europe lunch hours, and those of you that are interested in wider TCA issues, which we had lots of questions, there'll be lots of other occasions when UK and a Changing Europe will address the wider TCA. Today we were focusing on energy and climate cooperation. I think we had a great discussion, so many thanks.